who've built up a huge business from scratch. How do they do it? By designing the interior to look just like a library.
We try to, show the public what we're most interested in and bring them in, and they tend to, be interested in what we're recommending and follow us. And here we are, we put them up here, and these are the books we really care about. We care about all the books, but we really care about these.
Have a look at the books here. Some of them was nearly as old as I am.
This is one of the things we do. This is an out-of-print book search service which we run from here, whereby we get any book that's ever been in print, if we can possibly find it, and get it to whoever wants it. And we lose our shirts on doing it, but I think it's a nice service to offer the public. I use it myself.
Can you please tell me if you've got this book in? Yeah, sure. It's not actually in stock at the moment.
Well, here we have our guide to books, which is a catalogue of 45,000 titles in print, enormous listings of fiction, poetry, drama, and everything we can find. And it's our little recommendations, and a little bit opinionated, and nothing like it in the world. It always amuses me whenever I read a press article about Waterstones. It always seems to refer to the fact that our shops look like libraries. In fact, this afternoon I was reading an article in the Boston Press about a comment on our new bookshop in Boston and saying it looks just like a British library. And in a way that rather irritates me, in a way I regard it as a great compliment.
Faced with the explosion of the new upmarket bookstores, libraries felt forced to compete. But in stocking more and more bestsellers, they may have helped to hasten their own decline.
My experience with libraries over the decade has been very depressing. It's shown a decline in orders for all the books I publish. Mainly, I'm always told, because they're not what the readers want. The readers want popular fiction with a popular fiction cover on it. And some of the imprints with which I've worked even have a special cover for libraries, which is always rather ghastly, romantic sort of cover.
Libraries sometimes tend to forget that their job isn't really to have always a new book in all the time, but their job is to be completely reliable with their backstock and to have wonderful coverage of classic literature for children and families to find. And that is a real job for libraries to do, and I sometimes think they're too keen on competing with the bookseller.
Now, the three writers here are going to read in the order of Leslie Gaister, Danny Absey, and Antonia Byatt. And I'll ask Leslie if she'll go ahead.
Nowadays, if you want to see authors read from their work, you're much more likely to find them in a bookshop than a library. The gulf between the two has considerably widened. So is the battle to save Britain's libraries lost?
I think they're one of the most important things that Britain has got. But I think unless they turn their attention to what their job needs to be, I can see a government taking away even more money from them.
I really do believe so passionately that the book is not simply going to survive the century, but grow and grow and grow all the values of education and self-education, which is so much going to be a feature of the 1990s. I think the libraries should be beneficiaries of this, in just the way the bookshops are and will be.
I wonder which of those two institutions are, in fact, of greater significance to literature. And I would argue that a publicly funded and properly funded public library service is much more important to the culture of the nation, because it means that your access to literary culture is not limited by whether you've got any money in your pocket.
10 years ago, it would not have been possible even to think in such bold, ambitious terms.
There's no evidence that Mrs. Thatcher had any interest in architecture whatsoever. But of course she ought to have had, because architecture is the single largest, most visible manifestation of Thatcherism. The buildings which were built during the 1980s, during the Thatcher era, were a direct product of her economic and political system. Look around anywhere. Look around the City of London, look around Canary Wharf, the free ports, the enterprise zones of the 80s, populated with new buildings that shout, "We were built during Thatcherism."
This is the British Library. In a decade which saw a massive boom in private building, this was the only major development of cultural significance built by the government. In the 80s, architecture became a focus of fierce debate. Newspapers introduced whole pages on the subject, and the Prince of Wales introduced his subjects to his own personal views. But the debate went deeper than just the appearance of the buildings.
Architecture became the cultural attachment for a whole series of other debates about the way we are, the way we live, the sort of houses we want to live in. The architectural debate of the decade was, in short, old versus new.
There's a big bang in the city. We're on the main. We're SHOPPING. We're shopping.
The supermarket is a very good 1980s building to look at because it was a new building form. In the 80s, they moved out of the high street and they moved to the edges, the fringes of our towns and cities and grew in size enormously. So somehow we had to find a means of doing it. There was no ready architectural language. We couldn't look backwards to Roman supermarkets or Greek supermarkets. The Victorians didn't build supermarkets, so there was no historical architectural language on which we could rely. So what did we do? We disguised them, basically.
This is very much Surrey, isn't it?
Very much Surrey. Very much designed in the context of Surrey, and then further particularly very much designed in the context of Godalming.
Sainsbury's takes supermarket design very seriously. They're anxious to make these large buildings with even larger car parks blend into the surroundings. Most of the 25 stores they build each year are in what's called the vernacular or traditional style.
What we're trying to do is to design buildings that are contemporary, that reflect the year, the period in which they're built. And although they are traditional in the sense that there is a style of architecture that is already there on which they're based, they are nonetheless very contemporary buildings in their own right.
What the designers did was take the rectangular industrial building and hide it behind a curtain or a pelmet of traditionalism that went around the building. So when you see a pitched roof, actually, there's the edge of the flat roof of the industrial building, with just a little bit of tiling to disguise it. That exemplifies the supermarkets of the 1980s.
I mean, I first came here to look at the building, in fact. That was my first interest. The fact that it sells what I want to buy was rather secondary.
The tower that it's got on there is quite nice, weather vane on the top. Mind you, could have already been a tower, could have done with a clock on it, but the whole thing's quite pleasing.
The weather vane and the way they've got the triangles, it looks a bit like a barn, I suppose, farmish. But
I'll have to have a look. Hang on.
A barn?
Yes. An old-fashioned barn,
old-fashioned
actually, which is a merit to it.
The reason for building your supermarket like a barn is because people think barns are good, because barns are something to do with the countryside. The reason why they're built like that is to make people feel comfortable with the mass marketing syndrome which contains them.
Sainsbury's have commissioned some remarkable modern supermarkets, but trying to be modern brings its own problems.
The sale, of course, obviously picks up the nautical connotations of Plymouth.
Well, that's all very fine, John, but is this type of design still going to convey to our customers that it is a supermarket?
Well, I think in the context of what you mean by a supermarket, it is a design that is intended to attract people to it, to welcome them into it, to give them a sense of occasion on the approach, to identify the entrance and lead them to it from the car park, and to say welcome. I don't think supermarket design has to be that any more direct than that.
Perhaps Sainsbury's most extraordinary supermarket to date is Nick Grimshaw's futuristic design in Camden, North London.
He came up with something that, at first glance, I think is at odds with the Georgian and Victorian architecture in the centre of Camden. But the size of the development has fitted in extremely well with the relatively low-level buildings around it. At Camden did bring a lot of comment from both the architectural cognoscenti, who were very, very full of praise for the development. The public, in the main, have not been so praiseworthy.
Well, the shop itself is very nice inside, but I don't like the building at all.
I think it looks a bit more like a spaceship, the way you have the doors halfway down. I quite like it. I know a lot of people think it's awful, but I think it's a really nice